Okay. Hi, everyone. It's February the 2nd, and I have a sort of craft talk for our class to make. I'm more or less joining the two workshop groups together. I've decided that our theme, our subject of exploration this semester, is pretty clear to me. It's the subject of poetic structure. And clearly, narrative has a role in that as one particular point on the spectrum of, of structural modalities. Um, and compression is an important subject. We've read the Longenbach essay, of which only the first 3 or 5 pages is really useful, the discussion of the Ladies' Fan poem. And we're discussing your own poems too. But I want to undertake a pretty specific conversation right now today, um, and that is based on some very interesting remarks that was made in that were made in one of the papers I got of narrative analysis this last week, and it was Michelle Burke's paper. Um, I loved that Michelle talked about her the primacy for her of the spiritual and the supernatural element in poems. I loved it because those are words that people are usually pretty cautious about using, but they seem sort of quintessentially an element in many poetics. And one of the real reasons that we go to read poems as opposed to all the other kinds of uh, discourse that we have to submit to all the time. Another word for supernatural or for spiritual would be the poetics of mystery. Um, a poetics, an aesthetic, which seeks poems that have a mystery in them. And think about what that means. What that means to me right now today is that there's something that can't be spoken, that is nonetheless being circumscribed by the poem, framed by the poem, and held up for us, preserved, contained, and in a certain kind of way, dramatically implemented, so that we actually get to experience that sensation that we have of mystery, the mystery of other human beings, uh, the mystery of randomness, the mystery of fate, the the mystery of ourselves, and the ways in which aspects of ourselves are clearly not known or knowable to us. All those things. It's a very worthwhile thing to plant your flag in, to say, I care about mystery in poems. I don't care so much about explication. I don't care about a rational, meditative, discursive narrator making sense to me. I care about paradox. I care about the way that an image communicates something which really can't be put into words. And that's why it's being done in an image or a metaphor. So I love that Michelle asserted that. Now, another aspect, the context in which Michelle was asserting this as a value was quite interesting too. And basically, it seemed to me that she was saying in her paper that not narrative poems, but poems that have, in some ways, a somewhat anarchic, imagistic, disorganized surface, an associative train of thought which leaps from image to image. Leaping is an important word. Leaps from image to image without having to remain consistent to a narrative frame. So my dog and I went for a walk, um, and then the poem that leaps is suddenly talking about how subway trains in Japan are made from metal that was harvested from the wreckage of Nagasaki. And, we never even have to come back to the dog and the field and the narrator, because this is a leaping associative poet. I'm going to read you a little passage from Michelle's essay. She says, ironically enough, she's been talking about narrative. I find that contemporary lyrical poetry, which is something she opposes or counteropposes to narrative poetry, leaps far more than narrative poetry. Lyrical poetry will venture across the ocean and back again in the span of 2 or 3 lines. It will talk about a familial relationship in one line, and then about a pet dog and basket of lemons, and then a pair of smelly gym shoes all in one stanza. Lyrical poetry relies on the reader leaping from image to image without noting any specific story continuing throughout. Poems that are narrative have the ability to stay in one place, in one moment, and to explore all the different images and emotions that lay in that space, and so forth and so on. Um, uh, so the poetic supernatural is sort of the phrase that she uses. So this is basically an aesthetic that values the subjective, the internal, the psychic, the emotional life, which is expressed in images, more than the rational, the omniscient, the discursive narrator. Okay, not the poem that's about the world, but in a way, the poem in which the internal world and the external world are, in a way, continuous and contiguous and sort of fusing with each other, right? Okay, so I'm going to call this the aesthetic of the disorganized psyche. When a poem is disorganized, when it leaps from image to image, when even its syntax is broken and it presents itself in the form of fragments, basically there's a paradigm, a representational paradigm at work. And basically, the message to the reader is, I, the speaker of the poem or the maker of the poem, am so overwhelmed by my feeling. I am so intensely inside my own subjectivity that that I can't actually make complete grammar. I cannot tell you what my thesis statement is. I'm not going to be speaking rationally. I'm going to be speaking compulsively because I have to. I'm obsessed. These images are welling up inside me one after the other, and I'm just the conduit for them. So when a poem is fragmentary, or when it's disorganized on the surface of the page, in lower case letters, and fragments are sort of swirling around or scattered around spatially, or the images are discontinuous, so forth and so on, it's basically claiming my aesthetic is intensity. Emotional intensity is what I'm about. That's where I live, and that's what my poetry is about, right? So this is a pretty fashionable position right now. And you'll find in many of the magazines and many of the books that are being published, you'll find often even a superficially, unnecessarily, non-required, disorganized appearance on the page because it's cool, because it's hipster, because it looks chaotic, because it makes a claim to emotional intensity, and because that's the kind of poem that's kind of in now. Okay? This kind of poetry technically is philosophically opposed to rationality, to careful, meticulous, step-by-step thinking. It kind of scorns that. It's much more chaotic, anarchic. Another common word for it is Dionysian. Dionysius who rips himself apart, Dionysius who tears civilization apart and is not interested in being a spokesperson for civilization, but is interested in being a spokesperson for the intensely subjective psyche, which is happening, at a pretty high velocity. All right. But often that's a pretty superficial appearance that's being given to the page aesthetically. And I'm going to show you an example of this taken from a recent magazine. And I'm going to hold it up to the screen. You'll have this as a handout, but I just want you to read it if you can, all right? And I'm going to try to read it to you. Here's what it looks like on the page. Pretty sexy, huh? The work, simple, multiple random parenthetical mark. The work, simple. The bullshit, simple. Limited natural talent or endurance. Chain of tasks. Some of us help each other. Some of us are liars. way to the future, loose grasp, transparency, ideas without a process. Um, Ideas without a process. Shit, so hard to do this. Um, uh, how to put the charge into powered objects. Let the thing see you. Foam. Know what else? Maybe anciently prefigured this pool. A pebble in the gullet. A sour cancer. um, uh, Sour cancer. The American Imaginary. Oh, wow, that's exciting. It's going to be writing about the American Imaginary. No, never. But I know you. You're the same guy. White gangsters wear ties in the white imagination, otherwise compulsory, otherwise lacking insurance, over 50, body wrecked, service. Then, reporting for duty, unsatisfied, you still have not heard me. Okay? So this is a chaotic poem. It presents a highly disorganized surface. Um, it's it's got premises. It's disorganized for the purposes of emotional intensity. It's it it's simple grammar and fragments, has force, distress, extremity, but it forsakes the power of precise relations. In other words, we don't know what the fuck is happening in the poem. We don't really know who the speaker is. We don't know if there's a subject matter. The speaker is throwing a bunch of jigsaw puzzle pieces from different jigsaw puzzles and saying, "Here, you put it together. This is my um, this is my rant." Okay, um, but it really is. I'm sorry to say, and it doesn't mean that the person who wrote it, and I don't even know who wrote it, um, is a bad person. But this is not actually a real poem. It has no power or precise relations whatsoever. It doesn't mean that poems that are disorganized or fragmentary can't be truly powerful, but they still have some responsibilities in terms of meaning, in terms of the images belonging to a kind of coherent family relations. Um, they can leap all over the place, but there's a way in which we assume of the highly associative poem, and that's an important aesthetic term. The associative poem is that the relationships between the parts are deducible by a skilled reader. Okay, is that the mind leaps. Our minds do leap. Our thinking process, our mentation, our feelings, and our thoughts. They are discontinuous and associative. They don't have transitions. They aren't reasonable. We really are a pretty chaotically bunch of primates. Monkeys with car keys. But there still is in a good associative poem, as I will be showing you, there still is a certain kind of allegiance to a framework, and to the integrity of the psyche. Okay. Uh, Otherwise, the people in insane asylums would be our greatest poets. Um, but those people are fragmented. The job of the poet is not just to be fragmented. The job of the poet is, well, we won't even get into that. So, the aesthetic of disorganization is a fashionable aesthetic. It can be evident in superficial ways on the page in its textuality. It can be evident in its associative stream of consciousness, so forth and so on. I mean, T.S. Eliot is the 20th century poet who was best known for validating dissociative process. Um, the underlying thesis of his poems, The Wasteland and Proof Rock, was that the self is broken and modernity has broken the world into fragments. And that's why he says, against my ruins, I've shored these fragments. Um, so it's a legitimate aesthetic, and some of my favorite poets practice it in various kinds of ways. Now, I want to show you a poem which is sort of related to this aesthetic. And um, this is one of Michelle's poems from a week or two ago. Um, Michelle is an impressionistic poet. She is an associative poet. I like her aesthetic very much. And I like this poem that I'm going to show you a good deal. You'll find, by the way, I apologize in advance, I'm using your poems for my own aesthetic purposes. Um, uh, it just seems they're right there and they are manifesting our aesthetics in a way that is very immediate. And since we are all students, we all have a disease called uh, not knowing everything. Okay, and we're trying to learn more to become more conscious craftspeople. So I guess another thing you could say about the aesthetics of disorganization is that it values the unconscious more than the conscious, right? All of these distinctions, these binaries, these polarities, these aesthetic oppositions, they already are familiar to you. But to have their vocabulary and to be able to use them in your critical discussions and in writing your papers is crucially important for you to be able to learn from the poems of other people and then to internalize those lessons that you have articulated and then to become a better poet yourself. Okay? So the poems we see in workshop, I never see them as finished products. They rarely are perfect. My drafts are hardly perfect. I work on poems for very long periods of time before they cohere, and 9 out of 10 never do cohere because I can't marshal the continuity of representation of my thought, feeling process, or whatever my subject matter is. So I'm going to hold up Michelle's poem and I'm going to read it to you. And I want to make the point that this is a narrative poem. It practices the aesthetic imagination. Imagination is its dominant temperament. It's psychically intense, personal. Its materials are emotional and quite interesting. So I'm gonna try to hold it in a at a distance that's legible to you, so you can read along as I read from it. I'm terrible at this. I'm gonna have to figure out a better way to do it, but I haven't yet. Anyway, you have this poem. Here's the poem. Narrative with infidelity and longing. And notice the narrative thoroughness with which this poem begins. I think it's really very well done. Narrative with infidelity and longing. I couldn't remember which cab to hail, which spells to cast, or on which blocks to bury to parts of myself, on which blocks to bury to parts of myself, the parts of myself probably, that disappeared at the thought of how many women you touched and believed were more beautiful than me. Okay, so much clarity here. We're in a physical setting in the external world. The personal themes have been introduced. The jilted or unappreciated lover, and so forth. I stood outside of your apartment again in the snow more times than you asked because obsession rarely allows you to keep any of who you were before. All right? Great. I only wanted to be the mother of something like a fawn split open in the forest, inanimate but alive. I waited, and the red grew from me like I was birthing it. I wanted to show you tricks with a fresh deck of cards. I wanted to pull things from you like ribbons from the smooth wrists of a magician. All right? So many fine things here, quite visible, and you'll see that the beginning of the poem is the firmest, and in a way the best written, the most coherent. This is where Michelle is practicing the narrative mode, but the narrative mode with a lot of imagination in it too. Okay, and a lot of speed, which is something that her aesthetic values. A lot of speed, where we're getting so much narrative compressed and delivered quickly, that the lover who's apartment the speaker is standing outside has had many other women and believed them more beautiful than the speaker. And the speaker is standing out in the snow, forlorn and self-aware that she's the victim of her own romantic obsession, which will probably come to no good, um, but nonetheless. And you see in stanza 3, there's this wonderful intensification, emotional intensification. I wanted to be the mother of something, and this very strong image, like a fawn split open in the forest, inanimate but alive. I waited, and the red grew from me like I was birthing it. So what we see in those two stanzas, 3 and 4, is a movement to the interior of the psyche, where images are actually correlatives for emotional states, no longer correlatives for things in the outside narrative world, but with the inner world. So they're very intense. And then in the last two stanzas, I wanted to show you tricks with a fresh deck of cards. I wanted to pull things from you like ribbons from. And what you see here is basically the speaker leaping, if you will, to another kind of categories, other categories of metaphors and figures of speech, deck of cards, magicians. But you can see that there's quite a bit of discontinuity between between the first four stanzas of the poem, which go very well, I think. And then the speaker is trying to solve the problems that the poem has constructed. If you're building the poem and you're building it well, in fact, it gets harder and harder as you go along because you've limited the possibilities. You've constructed a narrative or a discourse in a world which has certain kinds of rules, certain kinds of themes and problems which you then are under the obligation to resolve, which means that your options get more and more limited. At the beginning of a poem can be quite freely associative because anything can come in. The reader is very tolerant. But if the reader is a good reader, the reader is aware of these significant moments and these kinds of structural obligations that the writer is committing herself to or himself to. So we can see certain kinds of intensities. We've got the narrative frame. We completely understand the narrative situation. We see intensities in the image of this fawn, which is a kind of wonderful image of vulnerability. And then we see the color red, which is both rage and also woundedness, which is intensifying. So we know that really that's where the poem's emotionally most intense moments has happened, right here, kind of in the center of the poem. And now the poem has to resolve itself, and the poem doesn't really know how to resolve itself. And so it actually jumps to another category of metaphor and even a whole other tonality. So in our discussions of metaphor, we've been talking about some of the key and compression. We've been talking about the ways in which tone is key to sort of understanding the narrative of a poem and also understanding sort of the rules of the game that are being presented. Now, I'm just going to pause there.